as taxpayers for the opportunity to serve the American people as a public servant, specifically dealing with hunger issues in sub-Saharan Africa, as I mentioned, for the last 25 years. What I'd like to do is talk to you and give you a little experience from one of my experiences from northern Kenya. And I'd like to ask you to look at that story that I'm about to tell you from the perspective of people of faith, if you are coming from the faith tradition and the faith perspective. What does the kingdom of God look like in this particular situation, in this particular village? And then as public activists, I'd like you to look at the same situation and ask yourself the question of what is government's role, what should government be doing? And then consider the question of whether those two perspectives are really the same or not. And my suggestion is perhaps that they are. Let me tell you the story. The story is about a small village outside of Lokochogio, Kenya, which is not far from the border of Sudan, where assistance was being provided to Sudan during the war that paralyzed the country for southern Sudan for many, many years. And in this particular area, it had been affected by the Turkana region of Kenya, had been affected by drought. And I was there with a delegation basically looking at the areas affected, and particularly with the government of Kenya, who was delivering assistance, food assistance, to some villagers who were in a remote area of that part of the country. We went to the village, we sat down, and we witnessed the distribution of a very small amount of food aid that was provided, as I mentioned, by the government. And individuals were called by name to come and receive their allotment of food aid. I remember particularly one elderly woman who came up and she was given her bag of corn, not a very big bag of corn, actually quite small, and she started to walk back to her seat. And in the process of walking back to her seat, she noticed there was a hole in her bag and that some of the grains were actually falling on the ground. So she was quite elderly, so this was quite difficult for her, but she stopped. She got down on her hands and knees and she began picking up these individual little pieces of grain. And as I was watching her, I began thinking about the question of what her needs were. Her needs were obviously for food to eat, but who takes care of her? Who's going to buy her food when this food runs out? Who's going to grow food for her when the community is not experiencing drought? Will there be markets for whoever's growing the food to sell some of the food so that they can get income to perhaps pay for her health care? Will there be markets to buy food if they don't produce enough food for her to eat? And ultimately, will the food that they have to buy so that they don't end up needing food aid, will that food be affordable or not? Now, as I think about these questions of all that it will take to help feed her while she's facing an emergency and what it would take, obviously, to help her over the long term, it raises to me the question that's central to how we provide public assistance and how we, as a government, try to respond to the needs of hunger, which is identifying people's needs. And to me, the most important crossroads issue between people of faith and people of action, public action, is the question of how we define their needs. Now, since I've been spending about the last 12 years of my work dealing with emergency food assistance, trying to prevent starvation, famines, and the like, I thought I'd like to talk to you a little bit about this question of needs. One way to think of food assistance in an emergency is simply to give food to a hungry person because they're in need. Another is to say, how do we give food assistance to somebody who might be starving, but in a way that doesn't make it more difficult for people in the community to be able to feed themselves? The second question is more complicated than the first. The first is important, but the second is also important. How we do it is very important. And that how we do it relates to the question of what does this community need? This community needs to be able to feed itself, just like we feed ourselves here every day. So I think that's really very important as we begin the process of respecting the fact that there are multiple needs. understanding what those needs are, dialoguing as much as possible with those in need to understand what those needs are, so that we can better articulate to our government those kinds of needs that basically require support with U.S. taxpayers' assistance. Now, I've been working on a particularly controversial program that has been implemented in the last Farm Bill, which deals with the question of how the United States provides food assistance. As many of you know, the food assistance that's provided by the United States historically has been food that has been bought by U.S. farmers. Traditionally, the food that was bought from U.S. farmers was considered surplus production. It was surplus that was made available to the government that the government saw as being beneficial and therefore gave food assistance to those in need. Over time, the program's changed. The United States government buys now food from farmers, but the food, until just this past year or so, was actually completely bought from American farmers. Now, many people criticized that, as you could imagine. Many saw that as being more about helping U.S. agriculture and U.S. farmers than it was about helping those who were hungry. And they criticized the program both ideologically and practically. And they said what really is required is a program that allows you, particularly in life-threatening situations where people are running the risk of starvation, who need assistance right away, that you should have the ability to purchase that food closer to the areas of need. That could be in the country affected or in the region affected. So the idea was quite simple. Use some of this money that was normally there to buy food from America's farmers, to buy from farmers overseas. Now, it doesn't, I'm sure you can recognize right away that there are winners and losers in that kind of an equation. And so therefore the question is, who wants to see this program continue and how shall it continue? Well, the bill was passed, the Farm Bill legislation was passed with a provision to do a pilot program. And the idea was very simple. Use these resources to design a program that helps those who are affected by disasters and crises without at the same time making it more difficult for people to buy their food. So going back to my point about need, it respected the fact that people in their communities need to be able to buy food, so let's make sure we provide food assistance practically. Now that is where we are right now. The government's in the process of developing this program to do that. And many would argue, myself included, that this is a real step forward to basically have a flexible toolkit to be able to respond to the needs of particularly those who are faced with the possibility of starvation. Now, I guess the question really to talk about now is how the overlay of the food price crisis relates to that particular issue. The food price crisis is really about the fact that those who normally don't buy very much food anyway are faced with the reality of buying even less because of higher prices. So this question of buying food locally and regionally becomes a bit more complicated. Because even though you want basically to respond quicker, you want to be able to help the farmers in the areas where they're poor, you want to spend the money in those locations, how can you do that at the same time without increasing these prices, particularly during a period of scarcity? So it makes this particular issue more complex. So where does that leave us? Well, it leaves us with the question of designing a program that is flexible enough to really respond to the two needs I talked about at the very beginning. The first need being the need for people to eat, particularly in emergencies, and the second was the need for people to be able to buy the food that they need to eat. Now, step back and ask yourself for a second, what about the politics of this? And as a government official, I can't really talk about the politics of this, or perhaps I shouldn't talk about the politics of this. But consider the question of who gains and who loses. Who are the farmers that are going to be selling food? Who are the millers that are going to be providing milling services? Who are those that are going to be providing the transportation services? And you begin to see very quickly there are very strong economic interests involved in this type of a program. So progress in terms of a concept, an important concept to be used flexibly to respond to need. But at the same time, there's economic implications that therefore cause political reactions. So, in the silence, what kinds of opinions and viewpoints will you expect to hear? You will expect to hear those economic opinions of those who either may gain economically or who may lose economically from this type of change. However, that dynamic changes completely when people of faith are involved in the argument who then say it's about need, it's about designing programs, it's about responding to need. The importance is to address the need.